He stood by the window of his 20th floor apartment, watching Chicago unfold like a carpet of light and shadow beneath his feet, when he realized he had built an empire so vast he could no longer see where it ended. Richard Warren Sears was 51 years old, with more money than he could count in a lifetime, and a company bearing his name emblazoned on millions of American homes. But on that winter night in 1914, as the snow fell silently on the city he had helped transform, something inside him began to break. It wasn't a sudden collapse, not a dramatic moment of revelation. It was simply the silent, crushing weight of realizing he had traded absolutely everything for something that ultimately could never embrace him back. The mansion he was about to build would be the physical proof of that trade. A monument not to his success, but to his loneliness. And he didn't know it yet. The story you're about to hear is not about a man who built an empire. It's about a man who was slowly devoured by it. It's about the true price of power, the one that never appears on balance sheets, but reveals itself in the empty stares during silent dinners, in the laughter that echoes alone in marble corridors, in the feeling of being surrounded by everything and no one at the same time. If you want to continue receiving stories like this, stories that go beyond the numbers and delve into the dark side of extreme wealth, subscribe to the channel now. It's the only way to guarantee you won't miss the cinematic narratives that reveal what luxury hides and what power demands. Stories created not only to be heard, but to be felt. Richard Warren Sears wasn't born rich. He was born on a farm in Minnesota in 1863, the son of a blacksmith who could barely feed his family. His childhood was marked by the absence of luxury, the hardship of manual labor, and the constant feeling that the world had more to offer than that barren, unpromising piece of land. When his father died, leaving the family mired in debt, Richard was only 14 years old. He could have surrendered to misery. He could have accepted the destiny that seemed so clearly laid out for him. But there was something inside that thin, determined boy that refused defeat. He got a job as a telegraph operator at a train station, earning a few dollars a week, and it was there, amidst the rhythmic sound of telegrams and the smell of oil from the locomotives, that Richard Sears began to understand how the world really worked. He realized that information was power, that communication was money, that the true secret to wealth lay not in working harder, but in working smarter, and he had a mind as sharp as a blade. In 1886, at the age of 23, Richard received a box of watches that had been refused by a local jeweler. Most people would have returned the merchandise and moved on, but Richard saw an opportunity. He bought the watches for a fraction of the price, resold them by telegram to other stations along the railway line, and made more profit in a few months than he had earned in years as a telegraph operator. That moment was the spark, the beginning of everything. He discovered that he could sell anything, to anyone, anywhere, as long as he knew how to communicate. And he did. The following year, Richard Warren Sears founded the R.W. Sears Watch Company. It wasn't a large company. It was just him, a desk, a stack of printed catalogs, and an almost supernatural ability to write sales copy that made people believe they needed what he was selling. He wrote as if he were speaking directly to each customer, as if he knew them personally, as if he were offering not just a product, but a gateway to a better life. And it worked. Orders started coming in, slowly at first, then in avalanches. Richard realized he had struck gold. Not a literal mine, but something even more valuable, the ability to turn words into money. It was then that he met Alva Curtis Roebuck, a talented and meticulous watchmaker who repaired the watches Richard sold. Alva was everything Richard wasn't: quiet, technical, risk-averse, but together they formed a perfect combination. Richard was the visionary, the born salesman, the man who dreamed big. Alva was the executor, the perfectionist, the man who ensured the products worked. In 1893, they officially formed Sears, Roebuck and Company, And it was at that moment that everything changed, because Richard didn't just want to sell watches. He wanted to sell absolutely everything: clothes, tools, furniture, medicine, musical instruments, bicycles, weapons, books, anything an American family could need or want. He wanted to become America's universal supplier, and he succeeded. The Sears catalog became a cultural institution. For millions of Americans living in rural areas far from big cities and upscale stores, the Sears catalog was the only window to the world of consumption. It was a dream book printed on cheap paper, full of promises of a better life, of comfort, of modernity. Families spent hours leafing through those pages, circling the items they wanted, planning their purchases with the care of someone making an emotional investment. And Richard understood this. He wasn't just selling products, he was selling hope. He was selling the idea that anyone, no matter how poor or isolated, could have access to the same things the rich had. And that idea was irresistible. Profits exploded. Sears grew so fast and aggressively that Richard could barely keep up. He hired hundreds of employees, built gigantic warehouses, expanded into new markets, launched bold advertising campaigns. The company became a money-making machine, and Richard was at its center, controlling every detail, making every important decision, working 18 hours a day, 7 days a week. He was ruthless, he was tireless, and he was becoming incredibly wealthy. But there was a cost. There's always a cost. Richard began to realize that the more the company grew, the less time he had for anything else. His life became an endless succession of meetings, reports, trips, and urgent decisions. He barely saw his wife. He barely knew his children. He was building an empire, but he was losing his humanity in the process. And worst of all, he couldn't stop. Sears had become an extension of himself, a living creature that demanded constant feeding, constant attention, constant sacrifice. And Richard fed that creature with everything he had: his time, his energy, his health, his soul. In 1908, Richard made a decision that would change everything. He decided he needed a home worthy of his success, not an ordinary house, not a comfortable residence. He wanted a mansion, an architectural statement of power, wealth, and achievement. He wanted the world to see that Richard Warren Sears, the poor boy from Minnesota, had reached the top. He bought a huge plot of land in one of Chicago's most exclusive areas and hired the best architects money could buy. He imposed no budget limits. He told the architects to create something spectacular, something that would stay in the memory of anyone who saw it. And they did. The Sears mansion would be a masterpiece of excess. 3 floors of absolute luxury, with more than 20 bedrooms, each decorated with imported European furniture, rare fabrics, and priceless works of art. There would be a library with hand-carved mahogany bookshelves, a ballroom with crystal chandeliers weighing hundreds of pounds, a dining room that could comfortably accommodate 30 guests. The floors would be Italian marble. The staircases would be made of exotic wood brought from Africa. The bathrooms would have gold-plated faucets. Every detail would be perfect. Every inch would be a demonstration of wealth. And Richard approved everything. He wanted that house to be physical proof that he had won, that he had escaped poverty, that he had become someone. But while the mansion was being built, something strange began to happen inside Richard. He began to feel empty. It wasn't a physical emptiness, not hunger or tiredness. It was something deeper, more disturbing. It was the feeling that he was building a gilded prison, that this gigantic house would be a monument to his loneliness. He looked at the architectural plans and saw too many rooms for too few people. He imagined the long, silent corridors, the empty halls waiting for parties that might never happen, the immense gardens that no one would have time to appreciate. And he began to question, for the first time in his life, whether it was all worth it. The construction took years, and during those years, Richard's health began to deteriorate. The stress of running such a large company, dealing with aggressive competitors, managing thousands of employees, making decisions that affected millions of dollars, began to take its toll. He developed heart problems. He began to suffer from chronic insomnia. He lost weight alarmingly. His doctors advised him to slow down, to delegate responsibilities, to take vacations. But Richard couldn't. He was addicted to work, addicted to power, addicted to the feeling of being in control of something so big and important, and he continued to slowly destroy himself. When the mansion was finally finished in 1914, Richard saw it for the first time, fully furnished and decorated. He walked through the marble corridors, touched the silk-covered walls, climbed the majestic staircases, looked out the window of the master bedroom, which offered a panoramic view of Chicago. And he felt absolutely nothing. That house didn't make him happy. It made him feel small, because he realized he had built something so grand, so ostentatious, so impersonal that it didn't feel like a home. It felt like a museum, a mausoleum for a man who was still alive. He tried to ignore that feeling. He filled the house with guests, organized elaborate dinners, elegant receptions, social events that attracted Chicago's elite. He hired a staff to keep everything spotless: butler, cooks, maids, gardeners, drivers. The mansion functioned like a small business within his life. But the more people he brought into that house, the more alone he felt, because none of those faces were truly close. None of those smiles were genuine. They were there because they were paid to be, and Richard knew it. His wife, whom he had met decades ago when he was still a young telegraph operator full of dreams, also felt the weight of that life. She had supported Richard every step of the way, had sacrificed her own happiness so that he could pursue his ambitions. But now, living in that cold, silent mansion, she realized she had lost the man she loved. Richard was no longer present. He was physically there, walking the same corridors, sitting at the same dinner table, sleeping in the same room. But his mind was always elsewhere, always at the company, always on the numbers, always on the next big deal. Richard's children also felt the distance. They grew up surrounded by luxury, never went hungry, never had to worry about money. But they also never had a truly present father. Richard was a distant figure, a powerful name, a generous provider. But he wasn't a father. He didn't know their dreams. He didn't know their fears. He wasn't there for the important moments. And they learned to live without him. They learned that a father's love came in the form of expensive gifts, paid bills, material comfort, but never in the form of time. And time was the only thing that no amount of money could buy back. Richard began having anxiety attacks. He would wake up in the middle of the night with his heart racing, sweating profusely, feeling like the walls were closing in around him. He would walk through the empty corridors of the mansion, trying to calm his mind, trying to find some kind of peace. But peace wouldn't come, because he knew deep down that he had built a life that was fundamentally unsustainable. He had pursued wealth so fiercely that he had forgotten to pursue happiness, and now he was paying the price. In 1914, the same year he moved into the mansion, Richard Warren Sears resigned as president of Sears, Roebuck and Company. It was a shocking decision. He was the face of the company, the soul of the operation, the genius behind it all, but he couldn't take it anymore. His health was ruined. His mind was exhausted. His body was begging for rest. He handed the reins of the company to other executives and tried to retire. He tried to finally live the luxurious life he had built. He tried to enjoy that gigantic mansion, those perfect gardens, that absolute comfort. But he couldn't. Because he had spent his entire life working, building, achieving, and now that he no longer had that, he didn't know who he was. He wandered through the mansion like a ghost. He sat in the library surrounded by thousands of books he would never have time to read. He gazed out the ballroom window, imagining parties that would never be as joyful as he hoped. He walked through the immense gardens, alone, hearing only the sound of his own footsteps on the gravel. He had conquered everything, And at the same time, he had lost everything. Because conquest without connection is empty. Success without meaning is just a cold number in a bank account. And Richard finally understood this. But it was too late. He tried to reconnect with his family. He tried to spend more time with his wife, get to know his children better, be more present. But the damage was already done. There was a distance between them that couldn't be bridged with goodwill alone. Years of absence, of inverted priorities, of unexpressed love, had created an abyss that was almost impossible to fill. They were polite to each other. They were cordial. But they weren't close. And Richard felt that like a physical pain in his chest. He had traded intimacy for empire, and now he realized that the empire couldn't embrace him when he felt alone. Richard's health continued to deteriorate. Doctors said it was his heart, that he had overworked, stressed too much, neglected his health for too long. But Richard knew it was more than that. It was his soul. It was the weight of realizing he had wasted his life chasing something that, in the end, didn't matter as much as he thought. He looked at that mansion, at all those empty rooms, at all that unnecessary luxury, and saw only a monument to his own mistake, a physical reminder that he had chosen wrong. He began writing letters. Letters to old friends he had lost touch with. Letters to business partners he had treated harshly. Letters to family members he had neglected. He didn't expect replies. He just wanted to say he was sorry, that if he could go back, he would do things differently, that he would choose people over profits, that he would choose moments over monuments. But he couldn't go back. Nobody can. Time only moves in one direction, and Richard was running out of time. In the spring of 1914, just a few months after moving into the mansion, Richard suffered a severe heart attack. He survived, but was left weak and dependent on constant care. He spent the following months mostly confined to his bed. Gazing out the window of the room he had so carefully decorated, he saw Chicago below, the city he had helped transform, the empire he had built. And it all seemed so distant now, so irrelevant. Because when you're lying in bed, struggling to breathe, no amount of Italian marble or crystal chandeliers makes a difference. What matters are the hands that hold yours, the voices that offer comfort, the presence of people who truly care. And Richard realized there were very few of those people in his life. He spent his last months reflecting, thinking about the poor boy from Minnesota who dreamed of a better life, thinking about the young telegraph operator who saw an opportunity in a box of rejected watches, thinking about the visionary businessman who built one of America's greatest commercial empires, thinking about the man who had everything and nothing at the same time. And he came to a simple but devastating conclusion. He had won the wrong game. Richard Warren Sears died on September 28, 1914, at the age of 51, surrounded by luxury and isolated by his choices. The mansion he had built to prove his success became the stage for his final solitude. Newspapers published long, laudatory obituaries celebrating his achievements, his entrepreneurial genius, his contribution to the American economy. But none of them mentioned the price he paid. None of them spoke of the lonely nights, the distant family, the emptiness that luxury could not fill. The mansion remained standing for decades after his death. Others lived there, other families tried to make it their home. But there was something about that house that never felt quite inviting. Perhaps it was the hallways that were too long. Perhaps it was the rooms that were too empty. Perhaps it was simply the lingering energy of a man who built a palace but lived like a prisoner. Eventually, the mansion was demolished. It gave way to modern buildings, new businesses, new stories. But the lesson it represented remained. Sears, Roebuck and Company continued to grow after Richard's death. It became one of America's largest corporations, dominating retail for decades, employing hundreds of thousands of people, serving millions of customers. It built the iconic Sears Tower in Chicago, which for many years was the tallest building in the world. It became synonymous with American consumerism, convenience, and trust. But eventually, it also fell, because nothing lasts forever. Not empires, not mansions, not the illusion that material success can replace what truly matters. Richard Warren Sears' story is not just the story of one man. It's the story of a culture that values achievement over connection. It's the story of a society that measures success in dollars instead of relationships. It's the story of all of us who at some point believed that if we just worked a little harder, earned a little more, achieved a little more, we would finally be happy. But happiness doesn't reside in marble mansions. It resides in holding hands, in shared laughter, in genuine presence. Richard built a mansion to prove he had won, but in the end, the mansion only proved he had lost what truly mattered. He traded his life for a legacy, and he discovered too late that legacies can't embrace you when you're alone, that fortunes can't converse with you over dinner, that possessions can't love you back. He learned the hardest lesson the hard way, that true luxury isn't what you own, but who is by your side when you own nothing else. And perhaps that's the most important lesson we can take from his story, that we are all building something, be it a company, a career, a reputation, a collection of achievements. But we need to constantly ask ourselves, what are we sacrificing to build this? Who are we leaving behind? What moments are we missing while chasing the next goal? Because in the end, when we're lying in our own beds looking back, we won't remember the awards we won or the numbers we achieved. We'll remember the faces we loved, the conversations we had, the moments we shared, and if none of that remains, everything else will just echo in empty hallways. The mansion that changed an American empire didn't change it because it was beautiful or impressive. It changed it because it revealed a fundamental truth about the cost of extreme success, about the price of unbridled ambition, about the difference between building a monument and building a life. Richard Warren Sears left us with more than an iconic catalogue or a revolutionary company. He left us with a warning. A reminder that it's possible to conquer the whole world and still lose your soul in the process, and that no mansion, however grand, can house an empty soul. Chicago continues to grow. New buildings replace the old ones. New stories erase the old ones. But if you walk the streets where the Sears mansion once stood, if you close your eyes and pay attention, perhaps you can still hear the echo, the sound of solitary footsteps in marble hallways, the heavy silence of dinners without conversation, the labored breathing of a man who had everything and realized it wasn't enough. And perhaps, just perhaps, that echo serves as a reminder to us all to choose better, to love more, to be present, because in the end, the only mansion that truly matters is the one we build in the hearts of the people we love. And that doesn't need marble, it only needs presence. If you felt something from this story, if it touched you in any way, subscribe to the channel now. Because here, you'll continue to receive narratives that go beyond superficial entertainment. Stories that reveal what luxury hides, what power demands, and what extreme wealth truly means when the doors close and the spotlights go out. Stories created to be felt, reflected upon, and remembered. And now tell me, what city are you listening to us from? Leave a comment. I want to know where these stories are reaching.